The day Clara Keating swallowed her pride and accepted a bag of flour from a stranger was the day she swore on her mother's grave she would never do it again. That morning had started like every other morning since her husband Thomas had died of fever 8 months prior, leaving her with 40 acres of drought-cracked earth outside of Dusty Creek, Texas, in the summer of 1882. She had woken before the sun, dressed in the dark, and gone out to check on the 2 remaining chickens that had survived the coyote attack the week before. The henhouse smelled of dust and hay, and when she lifted the nesting box lid, she found only one egg, small and pale as a river stone. She stood there for a long moment, holding that single egg in both hands, feeling the warmth of it against her cold palms, and she thought about her daughter, Ruth, who was 7 years old and had been asking for biscuits every morning for the past 2 weeks because she did not fully understand that biscuits required flour, and flour cost money, and money was something the Keating household did not have in any meaningful quantity. Clara had set the egg carefully in her apron pocket and gone inside to start the fire. She had rationed what little cornmeal remained and made a thin porridge, watching Ruth eat it with the kind of cheerful acceptance only a child can manage, talking about the grasshopper she had caught behind the well the evening before, its long jumping legs and the way its wings had flashed copper in the late sun. Clara had sat across the table from her daughter and smiled at exactly the right moments and felt the weight of the sky pressing down on her shoulders. It was on the walk into Dusty Creek, 2 miles along a wagon road that turned to powder in the heat, that she had first encountered Eli Keene. He had been loading supplies into the back of a buckboard wagon outside of Harmon's general store, stacking sacks of grain with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done hard work all his life. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a jaw that had not seen a razor in perhaps 4 days. He wore a plain brown shirt, work-worn at the elbows, and boots that were good quality but scuffed from long use. He looked up when she passed, and she had given him the kind of nod one gives a stranger in a small town, the polite, dismissive acknowledgement that asks nothing and offers nothing. She had gone into Harmon's store and asked old Pete Harmon if she might put a small order on account, and Pete, who was not an unkind man but who had a business to run and a ledger full of names already, had shaken his head with genuine regret and told her the account was already carrying more than he could afford to let ride until harvest season. Clara had stood very straight at the counter, the way her mother had always stood when things were hard, chin slightly lifted, back perfectly aligned, and she had said, "Thank you, Pete, I understand," and she had walked back out into the hammering sunlight without buying a single thing. She had been halfway down the steps when she heard his voice. "Excuse me, ma'am," she turned. The tall man with the dark hair was standing at the foot of the steps, holding out a sack of flour, 20 pounds at least, the good white kind, and he said it simply, without fuss, the way a person says a thing they think is plainly reasonable. "I noticed you came out empty-handed. I've got more supplies than I need right now, and this flour's just going to take up space in my wagon. You'd be doing me a kindness." It was such a well-constructed kindness, that lie. Clara had understood immediately that it was a lie, because no man buying supplies buys more than he needs, and no 20-pound sack of flour takes up troublesome space in a buckboard wagon with room for 20 more. But she had thought of Ruth, and the single egg, and the empty cornmeal tin at home, and she had looked at the sack and then looked at the man and said, quietly, "Thank you." She had carried the flour home in both arms, leaning back slightly against its weight, and she had made biscuits that evening and watched Ruth eat 3 of them with molasses, and felt something in her chest break open in a way that was part gratitude and part humiliation, and the humiliation was the larger part. She did not learn his name that day. She spent the following week doing what she had always done, working the garden, mending fence posts where the wood had rotted, trying to coax water from the well that had been running low since June, taking in 2 shirts from the Barrett family for mending and receiving 25 cents for the work. She thought about the man with the flower several times, not with warmth exactly, but with the sharp awareness of a debt unpaid, a pride still stinging. She thought about how he had looked at her, not with pity precisely, but with something adjacent to it, and she found she could not tolerate the memory of it without her jaw tightening. The following Wednesday she took her mending money and bought a small amount of flour from Pete Harmon, barely enough to matter, but enough to feel like she had restored some balance to the universe. She paid in full and walked home with her head up. The following Saturday she was at the well behind the Barrett place, drawing water for their kitchen as part of a work arrangement she had made with me Barrett in exchange for the use of their milk cow 3 mornings a week, when she heard a familiar voice from the direction of the road. Eli Keene was speaking to me's husband, Frank, leaning on the fence post in that loose, easy way of men who have time and weather in common, talking about the state of the creek and whether the summer rains were going to come late again this year. Clara stayed at the well and kept her hands busy and did not look over. She heard Frank say, "You settling in out at the old Prescott place, then?" She heard Eli say, "That's right, bought it in April, been fixing the north fence all week. Good land once it gets some water." She heard Frank say, "You'll know your neighbors then. Mrs. Keating's land butts right up against the old Prescott East line." There was a brief pause, and then Eli Keene said, with a neutrality so careful it was itself a kind of signal, "Is that so?" Clara drew her bucket and carried it toward the Barrett kitchen and did not acknowledge the conversation in any way. She thought about it all the way home that evening, however, walking the long road through the golden late afternoon light with the particular kind of irritation she had come to associate with the name, or rather the face, of Eli Keene. He was her neighbor. She had accepted flour from her neighbor. It was worse, somehow, that he lived just east of her fence line, that he would see her land every day, would see its cracked ground and her thin garden and the henhouse with its crooked roof, would see all the evidence of her struggle laid out plainly for a man who had already made the decision once that she needed his help. She resolved, with a clarity that felt almost medicinal, that she would never accept another thing from Eli Keene. The resolution lasted exactly 9 days. On the 10th day, a thunderstorm rolled in from the west in the early afternoon, the kind that comes in summer with more violence than rainfall, and a bolt of lightning struck the oak tree at the corner of Clara's property, and the burning tree fell directly onto the north section of her fence, splitting 2 posts and tangling the wire into a useless snarl. By the time the rain stopped, 3 of her 4 remaining cattle had walked through the gap and onto the road, and Clara spent 2 hours in the mud, in the dark, with a lantern that kept guttering in the wind, trying to herd them back. She got 2 of them back that night. The third one, a pale-sided heifer she called Francis, had wandered further than the others, and when Clara walked the road the next morning, she found Francis contentedly standing in the pasture on the other side of the east fence line, on Eli Keene's land. She stood at the fence and looked at Francis and then looked toward the small farmhouse in the distance, and after a moment she saw Eli Keene come out of the barn and stop, looking at her across the distance, and then he walked toward her with that long, unhurried stride that seemed to be his natural pace. "That yours?" he said, nodding at Francis. "She is," Clara said. "The storm took my north fence. I'll be through to get her in a moment if you'll tell me where the gate is." "Gate's down at the south end," he said. "I'll walk her back up to the line for you, save you the trip." Clara opened her mouth to say that was not necessary and stopped, because Francis was already in the middle of the pasture and walking down to the south gate and back up. The road would take 20 minutes she did not have, and she had 2 fence posts to replace before the rest of the cattle decided to follow their companion's example. "Fine," she said, which was the smallest word she could manage. He walked Francis back to the fence and handed Clara a length of rope he had fashioned into a rough lead, and when she reached through the fence to take it, their hands were close but did not touch, and she looked up and met his eyes briefly and saw in them a careful absence of triumph, which she found both decent and slightly annoying. "I'm Eli Keene," he said. "I know who you are," she said. "Clara Keating." "I know who you are," he said, echoing her words with a slight, not quite smiling expression. "Your fence is in bad shape, Mrs. Keating. That storm wasn't the only reason it went down. I'm aware of the condition of my fence," she said. "I've got some extra cedar posts from the work I did on my north line last week," he said. "You could have them." The silence between them then was about 2 seconds long, but it contained a great deal. "No," she said. "Thank you." She led Frances home and spent the rest of that day digging out the rotted post stumps with a spade that was too light for the job in her own arms, which were stronger than they had been a year ago but still not built for post-hole digging. She did not get the fence properly repaired. She managed a rough temporary fix that kept the cattle in for the moment but would not survive another serious storm. She was aware, as she worked, that she was being proud to the point of foolishness. She was also aware that she could not stop. 2 mornings later she woke to find a neat stack of 6 cedar fence posts at the edge of her property, just inside the road with no note attached. They were good posts, solid and straight, freshly cut, and they were accompanied by a coil of new wire and 4 iron staples. She stood looking at them for a long time. She thought about carrying them back to Eli Keene's gate and leaving them there. She thought about it seriously for a full 2 minutes, and then she thought about her fence and her cattle and Ruth, and she picked up the posts and carried them to the north fence line, 2 trips, and she fixed the fence properly over the course of that morning. But she turned the matter over in her mind all day, the way you turn a burr over in your fingers looking for the point. He had not given her the posts as a gift. He had not presented them with any expectation of gratitude. They had simply appeared, and she could not reject what was not formally offered, and he knew that, and the knowing made her feel something between respect and extreme exasperation. She went to church the following Sunday, as she did every Sunday, because Dusty Creek's small Methodist congregation met in the schoolhouse, and it was where neighbors talked and children played and information about the wider world reached people who lived 2 miles from town. Ruth sat beside her in the third pew and sang the hymns loudly and slightly off-key, with the innocent joy of a child who has not yet learned to be self-conscious about singing. Eli Keene was in the 5th pew. Beside an older man she later learned was a fellow called Dawes who had the neighboring spread to the north of the Prescott land. Eli had made an effort for church, his dark hair combed, his shirt clean and pressed, and he held his hymnal with the careful attention of a man who was not entirely sure of the words. He did not look at her during the service, or if he did, he was very good at the timing of it. After the service, in the yard outside, when people gathered to talk in the way that serves as both community news and community theater in small western towns, Clara found herself standing near enough to Eli to hear him tell Frank Barrett that he had planted a kitchen garden on the south side of his house, and that the tomatoes were coming in faster than one man could eat them. She heard that and thought nothing particular of it. The following Tuesday she found a basket on her front step. In it were 6 large tomatoes, red and warm from the sun, and a paper twist of dried beans, and at the bottom a small block of good cheese wrapped in cloth. There was a folded paper in the basket, and she opened it and read, in handwriting that was neat but somewhat angular, as if the writer had learned letters from a practical rather than elegant teacher. Surplus from the garden. No good leaving things to rot. E.K., she read it twice. Surplus from the garden. She could not prove it was not surplus. She had no way of knowing how many tomatoes his vines were producing. And the beans and cheese were not things that came from a kitchen garden, but they were in the basket, and the note made no specific mention of them, which was a construction of plausible deniability so careful it was almost elegant. She sat down at her kitchen table and looked at the basket for a while. Ruth came in from outside and said, "What's that?" And Clara said, "Tomatoes from the neighbor's garden." And Ruth said, "Can I have one?" And Clara said yes, and watched her daughter bite into a tomato the way you bite into an apple, juice running down her chin, eyes bright with the simple pleasure of something good and ripe and abundant. and Clara felt the stinging behind her eyes that she had learned to push back with the force of practical thinking. She would find a way to repay this. Not with money, perhaps, because money was scarce, but with something equivalent, something that was not charity received but value exchanged. That evening she baked an extra batch of cornbread, using her carefully rationed supply, and she put it in a clean cloth and walked it across to Eli Keene's east fence line and left it on the post with a small paper that read, "From my kitchen." She walked home in the long summer dusk and felt the balance of things shift slightly toward tolerable. She did not see him that day or the next, but on the day after that she was in her garden pulling weeds when she heard him on the other side of the fence, doing some work along his own fence line, and after a few minutes of this proximity, which neither of them had arranged and both of them were aware of, he said, without looking up from the fence post he was examining, "The cornbread was good." "Thank you," she said, without looking up from her weeds. After a moment he said, "You've got an aphid problem on your bean plants." "I know," she said. "Ladybugs help," he said. "I can bring some over from my garden. They've been clearing my squash vines." She almost said no automatically, and then she stopped herself, because ladybugs were not charity. You could not place a monetary value on ladybugs. A man bringing ladybugs from one garden to another was a neighbor being useful in the way neighbors were meant to be useful to each other, in the way that the whole frontier ran, on the practical exchange of small helps between people who understood that the land was hard and no one survived it entirely alone. "That would be fine," she said. He brought the ladybugs in a glass jar with a cloth top the next morning, and Ruth thought this was enormously entertaining, and spent an hour watching them distribute themselves across the bean plants with the solemn scientific attention that is the particular gift of 7-year-olds. Clara watched her daughter from the kitchen window and felt something she had not felt in 8 months, something unclenching in the place behind her ribs where she had been holding everything tight. She was not, she told herself firmly, feeling anything about Eli Keene. She was simply feeling the ordinary human relief of a problem partially solved. The weeks that followed developed their own particular rhythm, one that Clara did not quite plan and did not quite acknowledge, but which settled over her life the way summer heat settles over the plains, gradually and completely. Eli Keene was a quiet man by nature, not silent, not cold, but economical with words in the way of men who live mostly alone and have not fallen into the habit of filling silence for the sake of it. He had a dry sense of humor that surfaced occasionally, mostly through understatement, and a patience with the particular difficulties of the land that Clara recognized as the patience of someone who has decided to stay somewhere for a long time and is making his peace with it accordingly. He was 29 years old, she learned, not through any direct inquiry, but through the normal accumulation of neighborly information. He had come to Dusty Creek from Kansas, where he had worked cattle for several years on a spread east of Wichita. He had wanted his own land. He had found it here, bought the old Prescott property at a price that reflected its depleted state, and put his savings and his labor into bringing it back. He had no family she could identify. He did not speak of a wife or a past wife, and no one in Dusty Creek seemed to know of one. Clara was 26. She had married Thomas Keating at 19, when he had come to her father's farm in East Texas with good prospects and good manners and a plan for a spread of their own. The plan had worked better in some years than others. The land outside Dusty Creek had potential, Thomas had said, genuine potential, and Clara had believed him, because she trusted his judgment and because she could see it herself. The way the soil ran deep and the water table was reasonable if you dug far enough. But Thomas had died before the potential had been fully realized, and she was left with its raw materials and her own 2 hands. She thought of Thomas with love that had softened into something less acute over these 8 months, the particular grief of someone who has already begun the necessary work of continuing. She did not think of him every day now, which had at first made her feel guilty, and now simply made her feel human. In September, When the first hint of cooler air began to sharpen the mornings, something shifted between her and Eli in a way that was small but unmistakable. She had been struggling with the water trough for the cattle, which had developed a crack along the base and was losing water faster than she could replenish it. She had been thinking about the problem for 3 days, turning it over in her mind alongside all the other problems, calculating what it would cost to have someone repair it or replace it against what she could not afford. She mentioned it to no one. She did not mention it to Eli. But on a Friday morning she found a small wooden wedge and a tin of pitch sitting on her fence post with a folded note that read, "The trough at the Harper place was fixed this way last spring. Works well enough if the crack isn't too long. E.K." She stood at the fence post reading that note and felt, for the first time, something that was not exasperation, not pride, not the complicated mixture of gratitude and resistance she had been managing for months. She felt something warmer than that, something more personally directed, and she made herself examine it at the fence post in the September morning, and then she folded the note and put it in her apron pocket and went to fix the trough. The pitch and wedge worked exactly as described. The trough held water. She carried the empty tin back to Eli's fence line and left it there, and the next time she saw him, which was at the well on the Barrett property 2 days later, she said, "The trough is holding," and he nodded and said, "Good." And they stood for a moment in a silence that had changed in quality from the silences of earlier in the summer, and she was aware of it and so was he, and then he said, "I'm thinking about getting a second milk cow. Would you want to go halves on one?" She turned to look at him directly then, because this was new territory. This was not him leaving things at fence posts. This was him proposing an arrangement, a partnership of a kind. "Halves on a cow," she said. "You keep her on your land, she's closer to your barn," he said. "I take the milk alternate mornings. It makes more sense for 2 households to share the cost than for each one to carry it alone." She looked at him for a long moment. The September sun was on his face, and he was looking at the well, not at her, which she understood as a deliberate courtesy, giving her room to think without the pressure of being watched. "That's a fair arrangement," she said finally. He looked at her then, and something in his expression, some small relaxation around the eyes, told her this mattered to him, that he had been uncertain how she would take it, and the uncertainty was genuine, not performed. "Saturday," he said. "Cala's farm has good stock." "Saturday," she said. They went to Cala's farm together that Saturday, side by side in his buckboard, which was the practical choice because Clara had no wagon horse of her own, her horse being a saddle animal only. Ruth came along, sitting between them, her small legs not reaching the footboard, chattering with the complete confidence of a child who has decided that a new person is interesting and has not yet thought to be cautious about it. She told Eli about the ladybugs, which had apparently made a profound impression on her, and about the grasshopper from earlier in the summer, and about the fact that her favorite color was the particular blue of a cloudless Texas morning and not the blue of other things. Eli listened to all of this with the same serious attention he gave most things, asking questions at appropriate intervals, and Clara watched him from the corner of her eye and thought that there was something very steady about him, the kind of steadiness you find in mountains and old trees, a thing that does not advertise itself but is simply present. They chose a good milk cow at Cala's, a brown-sided animal with calm eyes, and on the way home Ruth named her Biscuit, and Eli said that was a very good name for a cow, and Clara laughed, actually laughed, the kind of laugh that surprises you because it is larger than the occasion seems to require. And she saw Eli look at her when she laughed with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something open and unguarded and quickly contained. The arrangement with Biscuit worked exactly as proposed, and in the way of practical arrangements that are working, it gave them a reason to see each other regularly that was not charity and was not coincidence, but was simply the normal business of 2 neighboring properties with a shared concern. He came on his mornings to get the milk, and sometimes he lingered at the fence post, or sometimes she came out with coffee if she had made enough, and they talked about the cow or the weather or the state of the road, and gradually they talked about other things. He told her about Kansas, about the cattle drives he had been part of, about the particular loneliness of being on the trail for 3 months at a time, and arriving somewhere and finding that the somewhere was less different from where you had started than you had hoped. She told him about Thomas. She did it carefully at first, the way you test ice before you walk on it, and then more directly when she found that Eli listened without trying to tell her how to feel about it or offering the particular kind of condolence that is actually about the speaker's discomfort rather than the listener's grief. He was a good man, she said one morning in October, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, the fence post between them worn smooth from being leaned against. He worked hard and he meant well and he loved Ruth and he loved me, but the land beat him, not quickly, not all at once, just gradually the way wind takes paint off a barn. That's harder, Eli said, watching something go gradually. Yes, she said, it is. The mornings were cold now, the October air carrying the edge of the coming winter, and their breath showed in small clouds above the fence post between them, and the light was the particular sharp gold of autumn, and Clara was aware, standing there, of a feeling she had not expected to be standing in, something that had been growing in the way prairie grass grows, not dramatically but persistently, until one day you look and the ground is covered. She took that feeling home and examined it carefully, and found she did not know what to do with it. In November, 2 things happened that changed the nature of what existed between Clara Keating and Eli Keene, and they happened within a week of each other. The first thing was that Ruth came down with a fever. It was not the first time Ruth had been sick, and Clara was not a woman given to panic, but the fever rose quickly and held high through the first night. And by morning, Ruth was flushed and glassy-eyed and talking about the grasshopper with the unfocused intensity of a child who is not entirely in the same room as the person speaking to her. Clara sat with her through that day and that night, changing the cloths on her forehead, trying to get water into her, sleeping in the chair beside the bed in short intervals. And on the second morning when the fever had not broken, she felt the particular terror of a parent alone with a sick child, the kind of fear that has no edge and no bottom. She had no money for the doctor, who lived in Dusty Creek proper and charged $3 for a house visit. $3 might as well have been 300. She did not send for Eli Keene. She did not send for anyone. But somehow, and she never found out exactly how, because the only connection she could imagine was me Barrett seeing her light burning at 2 in the morning when me happened to be up with her own infant. By the second morning there was a knock at her door, and when she opened it, Eli was standing there with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that was careful and serious. "Me sent word," he said, before she could speak. "How is she?" Clara was too tired to manage her pride with any sophistication. "Fever's high, won't break. I'm going for Dr. Marsh," he said. "I can't," she started. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you I'm going to get Dr. Marsh and bring him here. And that's not charity, Clara. That's what neighbors do when a child is sick." She had not heard him say her name before, not her first name. The sound of it in his voice, the way he said it as though it were simply what she was called and had always been called and he had always known it, broke something in her that she had been holding together with the tension of weeks and months of careful, dignified management. She stepped back and let him go. He rode to Dusty Creek and came back with Dr. Marsh before noon, and Dr. Marsh examined Ruth and said it was a respiratory fever and prescribed willow bark tea and cold compresses and watching, and he left some medicine that helped bring the fever down by evening. Clara sat with Ruth through the third night, and by morning the fever broke and Ruth asked for biscuits, her standard indicator of wellness, and Clara laughed again in the kitchen where Ruth could not see her, standing at the stove with her hands shaking slightly from relief. She knew Eli had paid for the doctor. She knew it the way you know things that have not been said but are present in the arrangement of facts. She thought about it while she mixed the biscuits. She thought about the flour he had offered her back in the summer, and the fence posts, and the basket of tomatoes, and all the careful small constructions of plausibility he had built around every act of help. And she thought about the way he had said her name that morning at the door. And she understood, with the clarity that sometimes comes after fear has cleared your mind like a hard rain, that this man had been finding ways to care for her that did not wound her pride because he understood specifically and precisely why her pride mattered to her. He had never offered her charity. He had offered her surplus tomatoes and ladybugs and shared cows and neighbor-to-neighbor practicality. He had been careful, consistently, to find ways to help her that she could accept without diminishing herself, and the care with which he had done this told her something about him that his words had not yet said. She needed to say something to him. She was not sure what exactly, but she knew that what was between them had moved past fence-post conversations and shared milk arrangements, and whatever it had moved to deserved to be acknowledged honestly. 2 days after Ruth's fever broke, when Ruth was sitting up in bed eating her biscuits with the satisfaction of full recovery, and asking to hear the story about the grasshopper again, even though she had been the one to originate it, Clara walked across to Eli's east fence line in the late afternoon and stood there until he appeared from the direction of his barn. He walked over to her with his usual unhurried pace, and when he reached the fence he put both hands on the top rail and looked at her, and there was in his expression a kind of readiness, as though he had been expecting something but was not sure what shape it would take. "You paid Dr. Marsh," she said. He did not deny it. "Yes, that's different from tomatoes," she said. "I know it is," he said. "I don't know how to repay that," she said, and heard in her own voice something that was not quite accusation and not quite gratitude and was the complicated combination of both. "I don't want it repaid," he said, and then he stopped, and she watched him choose his next words with the same care she had watched him put into everything he did. "I want Ruth to be well. I want you to be well. That's what I want." The October light was behind him, the sun getting low, and she was looking at him across the fence rail, and she said, "Why?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw in his eyes something she recognized, because she had been carrying a version of the same thing herself for several weeks, a feeling that had been growing quietly and steadily in the space between practicality and something else. "I think you know why," he said quietly. She did know. She had known for a while, actually, in the way you know things you have not given yourself permission to fully understand. She had known it in the way her mornings felt different on the days he came for the milk and the days he did not. She had known it in the way she had started, without really deciding to, putting on her better apron before those mornings. She had known it in the way his voice saying her name had broken something loose in her that she had needed broken loose. "I'm not ready," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to be." She looked at him a moment more. Then she said, "But thank you for the doctor, for all of it." He nodded, and she saw that the acknowledgement, the simple and honest thank you that cost her something because she meant it, meant something to him. He looked at her with an expression that was quiet and warm and patient, and she thought that patience might be the most underrated quality in a human being. She went back inside to her daughter, and she carried the conversation with her in the way you carry something delicate, held carefully, held close. November wore on. The first hard cold came, and Clara discovered that the stovepipe in her kitchen had a crack that was letting smoke back into the house, filling the room with a gray haze every time the wind shifted. She discovered this on a particularly bitter night and spent the first hour trying to manage it with open windows, which made the cold worse and the smoke only marginally better. She did not go to Eli Keene. Instead, the next morning, she rode into Dusty Creek and went to see if Pete Harmon had stovepipe fittings she could put on a short account, because Pete had told her in September, when the harvest had been slightly better than expected, that he could extend her a small line of credit to be paid after the winter. He did, and she brought the fittings home and spent a cold afternoon on the roof replacing the cracked section herself, Ruth standing below in her coat handing up tools when asked, treating the whole operation with the grave seriousness of an essential assistant. She fixed the stovepipe. It worked. She was inordinately proud of this in a way that was entirely her own, untouched by anyone else's help. That evening she made a pot of good beef soup, using the marrow bones she had been saving, and she filled a jar of it and walked it over to Eli's fence line and left it with a note that said, "From my kitchen. The stovepipe is fixed." She walked home in the dark and felt better than she had felt in months, which she considered from a variety of angles on the walk back, and found that all the angles led to the same conclusion. She was falling in love with her neighbor. This was a fact that she accepted with a kind of exasperated tenderness, the way you accept the weather. You did not choose it, it was simply the condition of the world you were in. The first week of December, Eli came to the fence on a Monday morning, not for the milk, which was a Thursday arrangement, but specifically hat in hand, with the expression of a man who has prepared himself to say something. "I'd like to take you to the Christmas social," he said. "You and Ruth, if you'd want to go." The Christmas social was the one significant community event of the winter in Dusty Creek, held at the church hall with music and food brought by everyone and enough warmth from the gathered bodies and the big central stove to make even December feel generous. Clara considered the offer. She considered it openly, standing at the fence, and saw that he was watching her do so, not impatiently but with the particular attention of someone who cares about the outcome. "Ruth would love that," she said. "I know," he said. "What about her mother?" The question was direct, more direct than anything he had said to her before, and she felt the weight of it, the small seismic event of a direct question asked by someone who knew she might deflect it. "Her mother would like that too," she said. The look that crossed his face then was brief and quickly gathered back into his usual composure, but she caught it, the unguarded flash of something warm and certain, and she thought that for a patient man, he had been waiting a long time. They went to the Christmas social, all three of them, in his buckboard because the road was too cold for walking, and Clara's saddle horse was not suited to passengers. Ruth sat between them again and informed Eli, with great authority, that she intended to eat 3 pieces of pie and possibly 4. Eli said that sounded like a reasonable plan, and he would try to keep pace with her. Clara sat beside him in the cold night air with the smell of cedar and frost around them, and the lights of Dusty Creek visible ahead, and she was aware of his arm along the bench beside her shoulder, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of it against the winter air. At the social, Me Barrett and several of the other women of Dusty Creek observed the arrival of Clara Keating and Eli Keene, and Ruth Keating with the particular attentiveness of small community women who have been watching this particular situation develop since approximately August and have opinions about it. Me's expression was one of warm, satisfied approval. Her husband Frank shook Eli's hand with the hearty energy of a man glad to see a good development confirmed. Eli danced with Clara. There was a fiddle player and a man with a harmonica and someone playing a battered upright piano that had been in the church hall for 20 years, and the music was lively and imperfect, and exactly right for a cold December night in a small Texas town. He held out his hand to her when the music started, and she looked at his hand for a moment, and then she put her hand in his. He danced the way he did most things, competently but without showmanship, leading with a steady hand and good timing, and she had not danced in years, since before Thomas's final illness, and she had forgotten that dancing was a form of conversation that did not require words. She was aware of his hand at her waist and his other hand holding hers, and the warmth of being close to him, and the music filling the space between all the ordinary concerns, and she thought, yes, this is what it is. Ruth ate 4 pieces of pie and fell asleep against Clara's shoulder on the way home in the buckboard, and Eli drove the long way without being asked, taking the route that went past the creek, now frozen at the edges, silver in the moonlight, and Clara sat with her sleeping daughter leaning against her and watched the winter landscape pass and did not say anything for a long time, and neither did he. And the silence was the kind that two people only arrive at when they no longer need to fill the space with words to make it comfortable. When they reached her gate, he got down and opened it and then helped her down with Ruth still sleeping in her arms, and she stood in her yard holding her daughter and looked up at him in the cold moonlight, and he was looking at her with the same open, unguarded expression she had seen once before, the one he usually kept contained. "Eli," she said. "Clara," he said. She thought of everything she might say. She thought of Thomas, and the 8 months of grief, and the summer of pride, and the fence posts, and the ladybugs, and the doctor's visit, and the dancing, and all the careful work of a man who had found ways to care for her that she could accept. She thought about what it meant to start something again, to trust the future again, to let someone matter. She said, "Come to supper tomorrow." He looked at her for a moment, reading all the things she had not said, and she saw him read them. "Yes," he said, "I'll come to supper." She carried Ruth inside and put her to bed and stood in her kitchen for a while, not doing anything in particular, just standing in the warmth of the stove, feeling the particular aliveness that comes with the acknowledgement of something real. December passed in the way of December, cold and short-dayed, and requiring the constant practical management of firewood and frozen water troughs and animals that needed additional feed. But it also passed with Eli Keene coming to supper on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and Clara finding that cooking for 3 felt different from cooking for 2, fuller in a way that was not merely about quantity. He brought wood sometimes, not offered as charity but as a contribution to the household he was eating in, which was reasonable and right. He brought Ruth a small carved wooden horse he had made himself in the evenings, and Ruth received it with the complete joy of a child who has not yet learned to temper enthusiasm. And she named the horse Biscuit Jr., because Biscuit was already taken, and she carried it with her everywhere for the next 2 weeks. On the last Thursday of December, the evening before the new year came in, they sat after supper at Clara's kitchen table with Ruth asleep in the bedroom and the fire low and warm in the stove. And Eli was looking at the grain of the tabletop, as though it held some information he was working out. And Clara was looking at him. And she thought that she had been looking at this man for months now with the careful sideways attention of someone who is not ready to look directly. And she was ready now. "I need to tell you something," she said. He looked up. "I am not a woman who does things by halves," she said. "When I was proud about the flower, I was not being foolish. I was being myself, and being myself means that when I care about something, I care about it completely and I do not step back from it. That can be difficult to be around. I've noticed," he said, and the dry understatement was so precisely him that she almost smiled. "I'm telling you because if you intend to pursue this," she said, and she held his gaze because she did not do things by halves, "you should know what you're pursuing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I came to Dusty Creek to build something that lasts. I bought land that was difficult because I wanted to be someone who stays when things are difficult. I've watched you these past months, Clara. I've watched you fix your own stovepipe on a cold day and haul fence posts and keep everything going on your own, and I have never once thought, there is a woman who needs saving. I've thought, there is a woman I would very much like to build something with." She sat with that. She let it settle the way good words settle, not rushing past them. "We're building it already," she said. "In a way." "Yes," he said, "in a way." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and it was the first time she had touched him, deliberately, without the mediation of a fence post or a cow lead or a dancing hand held for propriety's sake. His hand was large and calloused and warm under hers, and he turned it over and held her hand in his, and they sat like that in the quiet kitchen of the New Year's Eve with the fire burning low and the Texas winter pressing against the windows and the future, for the first time in a long time, feeling like a thing that was genuinely being built. January 1883 came in clear and cold, and with it a new quality to the days, the particular brightness that winter days achieve in Texas when the sky is hard blue, and the light has a crystalline quality that makes distances appear sharp and close. Clara and Eli fell into the easy movement of people who have made a decision and are letting it live in the world without needing to announce it to anyone. The town of Dusty Creek drew its own conclusions. Barrett told Clara, with the warmth of a woman thoroughly satisfied with a situation she had personally observed developing for 6 months, that Eli Keene was the most decent man who had come to their part of Texas in a good long while, and that nobody deserved decent more than Clara did. And Clara thanked her with a composure that was not entirely successful at concealing the fact that she agreed. In February, on a Sunday afternoon when Ruth was at the Barrett place playing with Me's children, Eli came to Clara's house not for supper, but to simply be there, which was a different kind of visit, and they sat in the parlor that Clara had done her best to make welcoming with the limited materials available, which meant clean curtains and a braided rug, and a few dried flowers in an old canning jar on the windowsill. The winter light came through the curtains and lay in long strips on the wooden floor. He took her hands in his and looked at her directly, which he had learned was the only way that worked with her. No indirect approaches, no carefully constructed plausibilities, just the direct thing. "I'd like you to marry me," he said. "Not because you need me, not because it's practical, because I want to spend the rest of my life in the same house as you and Ruth, and I want to work this land with you, and I want to see what we build when we're building it together." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "You understand," she said, "that I will always fix my own stovepipe." "I know," he said, "and I'll always know better than to offer to do it for you." She laughed, and the laugh was warm and whole and not surprised, and she said, "Yes, I'll marry you, Eli." He kissed her then for the first time, and it was everything that their months of careful approach had been moving toward, unhurried and certain. The way two people kiss when they have both decided it is exactly right. They were married in March, at the small Methodist church where they had both been sitting in separate pews since the previous summer, with Barrett and Frank Barrett as witnesses, and Ruth standing between them in her best dress, holding Biscuit Jr. in one hand and a small cluster of early spring flowers in the other, regarding the whole proceedings with the authority of someone who has personally approved the situation. The minister, a lean, earnest man named Reverend Cole, who had been performing services in Dusty Creek for 12 years and had a deep appreciation for human persistence, gave them a brief ceremony and a handshake and a blessing, and they signed the register in the cool March light and walked out into the churchyard where the first wildflowers were beginning to push through the dried winter grass. Clara became Clara Keene on a Tuesday in March 1883, and the small strangeness of a new name worn alongside her familiar self felt, after a day, exactly right. They merged the two properties practically, which is to say they began using both houses and both sets of outbuildings according to what made sense for the work, with the main household centered at Clara's slightly larger farmhouse, and the Prescott place given over primarily to the cattle and feed storage. The east fence line between the two properties became less a boundary than a convenience, a line across which they moved freely and often. Spring was the season of work in earnest. With 2 pairs of hands applied consistently to 40 acres, and then 60 when they properly joined the land records, the garden expanded, the cattle grew from 4 to 7, and Eli, who had connections from his Kansas cattle years that Clara had not, arranged a contract with a supply agent in San Antonio that gave them a market for their beef at a rate better than the local stock dealers offered. Clara learned, in the early months of their marriage, things about Eli that the fence-post conversations had not fully revealed. She learned that he woke before dawn every morning with the automatic alertness of a man who had spent years on cattle drives where sleeping late had real consequences. She learned that he had opinions about coffee, serious ones, and that his version of coffee was strong enough to strip paint, which she found both endearing and challenging. She learned that he was a reader, that he had a small crate of books under his bunk in the Prescott house that he transferred to their bedroom shelf with the careful placement of a man who values these things, and that he read at night before sleeping with the deep, transported attention of someone who learned to love reading in a time when books were scarce and therefore precious. She learned that he had, in fact, grown up poor. Not frontier poor, the dignified poverty of land ownership in hard seasons, but the other kind, the kind that lives in the towns, the kind without land or connection or the future that land implies. He had left his family's situation at 16 and gone to work for a cattle outfit in Kansas, and had been, in various forms, working for someone else's land and someone else's future until he had enough saved to buy his own. "That's why you understood," she said, one evening in April when they were sitting on the porch after supper, the spring night warm and smelling of new grass and the distant creek. "Why you didn't push the charity at me. You knew what it felt like." "I knew what it felt like to need help and to hate the need," he said. "I also knew what it felt like when someone offers help in a way that makes you feel smaller than you were before you took it. Versus the flour sack that just happened to be taking up space in your wagon," she said. He looked at her with that particular expression she had catalogued over these months, the slightly tucked corner of his mouth that was the quietest version of a smile. "I may have calculated that somewhat," he said. "Only somewhat," she said. "Considerably," he said. She leaned against his shoulder, which had become one of her favorite things to do, not because she needed to lean but because she liked the solidity of him, and he put his arm around her and they sat in the April dark watching the stars come out over the Texas plain. "I was angry at you," she said, "that first day and for a long time after." "I know," he said. "I was also grateful," she said. "I hated being grateful." "I know that too," he said. "I'm not angry at you now," she said. "I know that most of all," he said, and she felt his arm tighten slightly around her shoulders, and she let herself be held in the complete, unguarded way she had not been able to manage for a long time. In May, Ruth, who had been watching the development of her mother's marriage with the serious analytical attention she gave all interesting phenomena, formally adopted Eli into her personal canon of important people. She had been polite to him for months, then warm, then comfortably reliant, and the formal adoption was marked by the presentation of a drawing she had made at school, a picture of 3 people standing in front of a house with a cow beside them labeled Biscuit, and a small animal labeled Biscuit Jr. even though Biscuit Jr. was a wooden horse. The 3 people were labeled Mama, Eli, and Ruth. Eli received this drawing with the gravity it deserved and placed it on the kitchen shelf where it remained for the rest of the year and beyond. By summer, Clara was pregnant. She knew before she was certain, the way women know, the body making itself newly strange and significant. She waited until she was sure, nearly 6 weeks, before she told Eli, not from caution, but from wanting to know herself the full shape of the news before she shared it. She told him on a Sunday morning before church, in the kitchen where they always had their most important conversations, because the kitchen was where things were real in a farmhouse, where the ordinary business of sustaining life happened, and it felt right to say real things there. He went very still when she told him, the kind of stillness that is not absence but the opposite, a full presence that has gathered itself in to contain something large. "You're sure?" he said. "Yes," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and put his arms around her, and she felt the deliberate care of how he held her, not tight, not overwhelming, but complete, and she heard him take a long breath against her hair, and after a moment he said quietly against the top of her head, "Thank you." She laughed a little at that. "You're welcome," she said, "though I believe the attribution is somewhat shared." "You know what I mean," he said, and she did. Ruth was told over supper that evening, and her response was to ask several highly practical questions, including, would the baby have its own room? Would it be allowed to play with Biscuit Jr.? And was it going to cry in the night, because she had heard babies cried in the night from me, Barrett's youngest, and it had seemed excessive. Clara addressed these questions with the seriousness they deserved and told Ruth that yes, the baby would likely cry at night, and that Ruth had also cried at night once, and Ruth said that she didn't remember that, and Eli said that not remembering your own crying was a significant advantage that babies had over everyone else, and Ruth thought about this and decided it was probably true. The summer of 1883 was better than the summer of 1882, which Clara thought about occasionally. The two summers compared, and felt the distance between them as something like a measure of everything that had changed. The land was producing. The cattle arrangement was working. She was no longer hauling herself through each day on pure willpower and the inherited stubbornness of her mother's bloodline. She was still proud. She still fixed her own stovepipe, or would have if the stovepipe had needed fixing, which it did not because Eli had replaced the entire stack in March with good iron that would last 20 years. She still stood straight and managed her own affairs and said what she meant and did not accept things she had not earned. But pride in its proper place, she had come to understand, was not the same as pride used as a wall. The wall had come from fear, from the terror of being seen as a woman who could not manage, who was sinking, who needed to be rescued. She had not been sinking, but she had been so afraid of appearing to sink that she had nearly drowned standing up. Eli had never tried to rescue her. That was the thing she came back to in quiet moments, turning it over with gratitude. He had simply made sure the ground was a little more solid under her feet, in ways she could accept without diminishing herself, and then he had waited while she walked to him on her own. The child came in February 1884. It was a hard birth, as first births for a body already past 20 often are, and Dr. Marsh was present this time without any financial negotiations, because they had the money to pay him, and Clara had insisted on planning for this properly 6 months in advance, which Eli had regarded with an expression of unsurprised approval. It took most of a long night, and in the morning there was a boy, red-faced and outraged at the world, with dark hair that was clearly his father's, and a set of lungs that suggested Ruth's initial concerns about nighttime crying had been entirely well-founded. Eli was allowed in after the doctor had finished his work, and he stood at the bedside looking at Clara and then at the boy she held, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, completely without containment, open all the way through. "He's real," he said, which was not exactly the most articulate thing he had ever said, but which Clara understood completely. "He is quite real," she said. "Very loud, definitely real." Ruth, who had been waiting at Mee Barrett's house through the night and brought back by Frank Barrett in the early morning, came in and regarded her new sibling with the expression of a scientist reviewing potentially useful data. "He's smaller than I expected," she said. "He'll grow," Clara said. "Does he have a name?" Clara looked at Eli. They had discussed names in the practical way of prepared people, had landed on several possibilities, had been unable to fully decide because naming a person you have not yet met requires a willingness to guess at them. "Thomas," Clara said, "not with grief, or not only with grief, but with the kind of love that includes memory and honors it." She looked at Eli as she said it, making sure. He nodded slowly, with the understanding of a man who had loved her long enough to know who Thomas Keating was to her and to honor that without jealousy, because what she had loved before did not diminish what she loved now. "Thomas Keene," she said. Ruth thought about this and decided it was an adequate name. Thomas Keene grew. He was loud and energetic and deeply interested in the cattle from the moment he could walk, which he managed at 10 months, with the particular wobbling determination of a child who has somewhere to be. By the time he was a year old, he had formed a devoted attachment to Biscuit the cow, which Biscuit tolerated with bovine composure. And by the time he was 2, he was following his father around the farm with the focused attention of an apprentice who takes his work seriously. In 1885, the spring rains came generously after 2 lean years, and the land around Dusty Creek bloomed with the particular extravagance of long dry earth finally given what it needs. The Keene property, 60 acres now properly registered and recorded, produced well beyond what they needed for the household, and Eli took the surplus to the San Antonio market himself that summer and came back with the best return they had seen. That fall, Clara and Eli Keene sat on the porch of their farmhouse in the September evening, the same porch where she had first told him she knew what it felt like to be angry and grateful at the same time. And Ruth was inside helping Thomas, who was now 18 months old, avoid getting into things that were not for him. And the stars were coming out over the Texas plain the way they always did, abundantly, as though the sky felt no need to be economical about light. Clara was watching the stars and thinking, which Eli recognized and let her do. After a while she said, "Do you remember the flower?" "The flower," he said. He knew exactly what she meant. "The first day," she said. "Outside Harmon's store." "Yes," he said. "I was so ashamed," she said. "I walked home with that sack and I made biscuits and I watched Ruth eat them and I was ashamed, which was wrong because shame was the wrong response to being helped, but I didn't know how to feel anything else." "You weren't wrong to feel it," he said. "People offer help in ways that are really about them feeling better about someone else's difficulty. It's reasonable to be wary of that." "But you were different," she said. "I tried to be," he said. "Why?" She said, not the way she had asked it at the fence that autumn, with confusion and challenge, but genuinely curious now, looking back at the beginning of everything from the other side of it. He was quiet for a moment, thinking about it with the same honesty he brought to most things. "Because you were clearly not someone who needed rescuing," he said. "You were someone who needed resources. There's a difference. Rescuing is about the person doing the saving. Resources are about the person using them." She turned to look at him. "You thought all that when you were standing outside Harmon's store with a sack of flour." "I thought some of it," he said. "I worked out the rest over time." She looked at him for a moment, and then she put her head against his shoulder, which was still one of her favorite things, and he put his arm around her, and the night was warm and full of cricket sound and the distant lowing of the cattle, and the life they had built was around them in every direction, imperfect and sufficient and deeply, entirely real. "I love you," she said. She had said it before, many times now, but she said it each time as though it were information rather than performance, because that was who she was. "I love you," he said the same way, because he had learned from her. The Keene family added a daughter in the autumn of 1886, a small and imperious person who arrived 3 weeks early, and immediately demonstrated the opinion that all arrangements should be adjusted to suit her. They named her Margaret, after Clara's mother, and she grew into her imperious nature fully, ruling the farm animals and her older brother with equal confidence, and being indulged by her father in ways that Clara observed with tolerant amusement. By 1887, the small farm outside Dusty Creek that had been 40 acres of drought-cracked grief, when Clara Keating had stood at her empty well with a single egg in her apron pocket, had become a proper working spread. The cattle numbered 18. The garden supplied not only the household but a regular arrangement with the Dusty Creek General Store, where Pete Harmon stocked their preserved goods on a shelf with a small paper sign that Clara had made herself. The account she had once stood at Pete's counter trying to extend, hat in hand and pride burning, now ran in the other direction. Ruth Keating, who had grown to 11 years old and showed every sign of developing her mother's combination of intelligence and determination, alongside her own considerable gifts, which included a mathematical ability that astonished her schoolteacher, was thriving in ways that made Clara think of all the mornings she had stood in a cold kitchen, calculating how to feed her daughter on what was not enough, and feel the distance of it as a measure of how far things had come. Thomas Keene, 4 years old, had successfully annexed the barn as his personal domain, and spent his days there with the cattle and the horses and the chickens, with the contentment of a person who has found his right place in the world at a very early age. Margaret, 1 year old, had taken her first steps in October, 3 of them, and then sat down with an expression of elaborate indifference, as though she had proven the point and would continue when she was good and ready. One October morning the same month Margaret walked her 3 steps, Clara was in the kitchen garden doing the last of the autumn harvest, pulling the carrots that had done well this year, putting them in the basket at her knee, when she heard Eli come out of the barn and stop, and she looked up and found him watching her from across the yard. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just looking." She looked at him looking at her, and she thought of that first morning, the stranger outside Harmon's store, the sack of flour, the pride that had been both her armor and her cage, the long, careful year of fence posts and ladybugs and shared cows and cornbread left at fence lines. All of it. The whole magnificent and unlikely construction of how two people find their way toward each other on the hard and beautiful frontier. She thought of all the things she had been afraid of that she was no longer afraid of, and all the things that had seemed impossible that were simply, now, her daily life. "Come help me with these carrots," she said. He crossed the yard and crouched beside her and pulled carrots out of the dark Texas earth, and they worked side by side in the October morning, with the light coming in long and gold from the east, and the children's voices audible from inside the house. And the world was exactly the size it needed to be. There had been a woman once who walked 2 miles along a powder dust road into a small Texas town with an empty purse and a chin held high, and who stood at a store counter and heard the word no and said thank you, and walked out into the sun and down the steps and across the path of a stranger who held out a sack of flour and told her a kind lie. She had taken the flour. She had hated herself for it. She had vowed never again, and then she had found that never again was not the same thing as refusing all connection, and that pride properly understood was not a wall but a standard, and that a man who understood the difference between charity and resources, between rescuing and simply standing close enough to catch someone if they chose to reach, was not a threat to her self-sufficiency, but its most perfect complement. She had built a life with this man on 60 acres of Texas earth, and she had built it herself, alongside him, neither of them carrying the other but both of them carrying the same load, the way the frontier taught people to do if they were paying attention and willing to learn. The carrots were good that year. The winter would be manageable. The children would grow. The cattle would thrive. The farm would continue to produce and expand and root itself more deeply into the land that Clara Keene had decided. In that first terrible winter after Thomas's death, she was going to keep no matter what it cost her. It had cost her pride in the end. Not all of it, not the part that mattered, but the fearful part, the armored part, the part that had been willing to let Ruth go hungry rather than accept a bag of flour from a neighbor who meant only kindness. That part she had surrendered, not because she was forced to, but because she had seen, in the careful and patient and endlessly inventive decency of Eli Keene, that there was something better on the other side of it. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet and the Texas night pressed close around the windows, they sat together the way they had always sat, comfortable in silence or in words with equal ease, and Clara thought about how extraordinary and ordinary it all was, the simple daily fact of a life shared, the way love, once it has found its proper shape, stops feeling like a risk and starts feeling like the ground under your feet. Solid and supporting and always there when you put your weight down, she had accepted his charity once. She had said never again. He had found ways to help her that were not charity, and in the finding, he had found his way to her, and she had found her way to him. And what they had built on that dry and promising Texas land was not a rescue and not a charity case, but simply a life, full and honest and tended with both their hands, which was exactly what she had always wanted and more than she had, in the hardest moments, allowed herself to believe she might still have. The October light moved across the kitchen garden, warm and golden and generous, the way Texas light is in autumn when the summer heat has eased, and the world is rich with the last good harvest before winter. Clara Keating, who was Clara Keene now, pulled carrots out of the earth beside the man she loved and put them in the basket between them, and the day was exactly what it was, and it was enough, and it was everything.